Chapter 18. HQ Bomber Command Communications Flight R.A.F. Booker. Most people are probably unaware that many of the scenes in the film, those amazing men and their flying machines, were shot at Booker, which is now a civilian airfield. However, in the year 1954 it was an R.A.F. station housing the Bomber Command Communications Flight, and the University of London Air Squadron. Most of the engineering and administration services were provided by Airwork Limited with civilian staff. Having civilian engineers handling our aircraft was a new experience for me, but I soon settled to this arrangement. Anyway, most of them were ex-R.A.F. and pretty familiar with the aircraft and the flight. BCCF had a variety of aircraft comprising the Commander-in-Chief's de Havilland Devon, 6 Ansons, 4 Oxfords and 3 DH Chipmunks and 1 Gloucester Meteor jet based at R.A.F. Benson some 10 miles away. After a year or so the Oxfords were replaced by Ansons. The role of BCCF was to provide communications flying and continuation training aircraft for the staff of HQBC. We also have a small commitment to provide the aircraft for the same purposes for the staff of Joint Services Staff College at Latimer, a few miles away. R.A.F. Booker, commanded by a squadron leader, was an airfield situated 800 feet up on the hills, 3 miles outside High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. It was 10 miles from HQBC on the other side of the High Wycombe Aylesbury Valley at Knapp Hill. Booker was a grass field with its longest run being 900 yards on a NW to SW line, and was an airfield which required care to operate from, due to its limited size and obstructions surrounding the area. My predecessor was a squadron leader, Bob Potts Jeter, a man of over 50 years of age, and of South African birth. Serving in the R.A.F. Pot, as he was universally known, was quite a character who had got himself well and truly entrenched as the OC, the flight and personal pilot to the Commander-in-Chief. He had a home near Mullow and quite a few commercial ventures in the area. He welcomed me, but I soon found out that he was in no hurry to give his job up. He had formed a close relationship with the former Commander-in-Chief, Air Chief Marshal Sir Pew Lloyd, and this had helped him to hang on to the post well beyond the normal tour. I realized that I would have to play the situation carefully, for he had the task to train me in the role. Had he wished to, he could easily have recommended that I was unsuitable for the job. Patience was the answer, so I allowed him to regard me as his protege, and this worked very well. In the event we got on famously, and enjoyed flying together. Pot, his wife and family, and my family became very good friends. Eventually, after a few weeks, Pot moved up to a staff job at the HQ. We continued to fly regularly together, mostly in the Meteor doing continuation training. We also enjoyed many good family occasions. The R.A.F. staff at BCCF were all aircrew, a mixture of officer and NCO pilots and navigators. They turned out to be a good bunch who had worked very well together. It was an enjoyable and interesting flying job for all, and we traveled all over UK and quite often to France and Germany. The variety of aircraft types to fly also added to the interest. Pot helped me a great deal, and especially in settling to working with civilian staff. One bit of advice was very good. He told me not to expect the engineers to call me sir. However, if they got to like you, they would treat you with all the respect required. I found after a while they did, in fact, address me as sir, without prompting. This courtesy was normally only reserved for their civilian chief engineer, so I was quite pleased to enjoy such an accolade. Initially, Gladys and I, along with Valerie, were allocated temporary accommodation in an R.A.F. rented housing. We lived for 6 weeks in the old post house in Stokenchurch, a pleasant Buckinghamshire village between High Wycombe and Oxford. It was lovely to have the family with me again, especially following the separation when I was in the later stage of my tour in Trieste. Valerie was now 9 years old and a lovely little girl, due to Gladys and her family, who over the years had brought her up to be a happy and well-behaved girl, who really enjoyed life. Valerie and I had a very close bond, which has remained ever since her childhood. We loved playing and going out together, and she was very, very special to me. We were a happy family and spent as much time as possible together. After 6 weeks in Stokenchurch, we were allocated a brand new married quarter, at what was named the Greenwood site, alongside the HQ at Knapp Hill. My navigator was Flying Officer Alex Mackenzie, who apart from being an excellent navigator, became a firm friend. Mac, as he was known, and his wife Frida also got a quarter on Greenwood. Since we flew together so regularly, we were able to share cars to travel the 7 miles from HQ to Booker. Mac joined BCCF just a little earlier than I, so we were able to look forward to a long and successful association flying together. We achieved this, helped by Mac's innovative ideas on devising ways of getting in and out of Booker in adverse weather. We established several letdown systems, using the aids in the aircraft to approach and land via designated ground features, with time and distance approaches. From these time and distance parameters, a safe reduced height approach could be made. One such approach was to fly visually down the valley to High Wycombe until we reached West Wycombe Church. This famous church had a large golden bull on its steeple, large enough to house about a dozen people. It had been the meeting place of the notorious Hellfire Club in the 19th century. It was therefore a very unique and distinct geographical feature. From this distinctive feature, using the Rebecca radar in the aircraft for distance measurements from Booker, we could let down safely in low cloud and poor visibility. We devised a similar scheme from the town of Marlow, in particular, its distinctive bridge coming in on a different approach direction. Booker, being 800 feet up on the Chilterns, had a sharp drop over several hundred feet to southwest towards R.A.F. Benson. With the cooperation of their air traffic control, we could, should we lose an engine on takeoff, approach on a direct line to their SW runway. As we cleared the Booker Hill, we gained almost 800 feet over the flatter Benson area. This was a really excellent method to make a safe emergency approach into Benson should this ever be necessary. We also developed excellent cooperation with London Radar at R.A.F. Uxbridge, who, provided we phoned them advising them our exact takeoff time, would pick us up as we got airborne from Booker. They could then provide radar direction to steer us clear of conflicting traffic through the dense air traffic in the London area. It was a safe and first-class service, invaluable when the Commander-in-Chief was on board, enabling us to avoid any time wasting en route due to heavy traffic. As we commenced flying the Commander-in-Chief, Air Marshal Sir George Mills, on his various visits around the country, we needed to gain his confidence in our ability to fly him safely in bad weather. This especially applied to Lady Mills, whom Sir George was particularly anxious not to frighten in the air. On one early flight to one of the bomber bases, we learned that the weather was closing in at Booker. On arrival at the aircraft for the return flight, Sir George asked if we could get into Booker safely. I said I thought we could, but I advised him of alternative airfield diversions nearby where he could reach HQ by car. He said, "You're not going to frighten me, are you?" I replied very positively that I wasn't going to frighten anybody, sir. Including myself. Sir George said, "Well said, let's go." We got into Booker without incident before the weather closed in, and after that he never questioned my advice. In fact, when senior officers at various places he visited tried to advise him, he would say, "Let's leave it to Bates to advise me." This gave me great confidence and also considerable respect from others concerned. Sir George was one of the old school and called all the staff by the surnames, and from him it seems absolutely correct and in no way offensive. He was one of the finest very senior officers I ever had the privilege to serve under. He had complete integrity, something I did not always find in others of his seniority. Sir George was also a very considerate commander and was respected by everyone, a fact demonstrated when Gladys had a major operation. He would phone up every morning as soon as he arrived at his desk and inquire after her health. He would insist that none of our trips should interfere with my visits to see her in hospital. Men like that you will die for. When he finally retired as an Air Chief Marshal, he became Black Rod in the Houses of Parliament, a tribute to his integrity and the esteem he held, both in and outside the service. Lady Mills was also a lovely person to fly and equally respected by all those around her. The quality of Sir George was demonstrated when we flew him and Lady Mills to Cranwell, where they were to stay for the night. After dropping them off, we returned to Booker, and on landing, with just Mackenzie and I on board, the nosy wheel of the Devon collapsed. The aircraft slithered along the undercarriage and the propellers were badly damaged, plus various other superficial damages to the fuselage. I had the unenviable task of phoning Sir George to tell him that we had crashed on landing. His first words were, "Are you both unhurt?" and when I replied that we were okay, he said, "Thank God for that." Fortunately, the reason for the nose wheel collapse was a technical failure, caused by the nose wheel having been overfilled with hydraulic oil. As a result, it was solid instead of flexible, as it should have been. This fault had not shown up on takeoff, or on the smooth runway at Cranwell, but at Booker the ground was quite rough in places. There had been some recent rain and the grass area was soft. And this showed by the wheel marks that I had landed smoothly on the main wheels first and the nose wheel had not contacted the ground for some 200 yards later. The nose wheel had sheared when it went over a roughish patch of grass. I was, thankfully, completely exonerated from blame. Sir George said I would never have expected it otherwise. In characteristic manner. During my period as personal pilot to the Commander-in-Chief, we also carried a number of other very distinguished officers. Amongst these were the former Governor-General of New Zealand, Marshal of the Royal Air Force Lord Newell, Air Chief Marshal Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, a former Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command. Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir William Dixon, then Chief of Air Staff, later to become the first R.A.F. Chief of Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Puloyd. A former Commander-in-Chief Bomber Command, Air Marshal Sir Dermot Boyle, Commander-in-Chief Flight Command, who later became Chief of Air Staff. We also carried a number of other dignitaries, including MPs, ministers and bishops. It was a very interesting part of the job to get the chance to meet all these distinguished personages. One memorable visit was to Geneva for the celebrations of the 50th anniversary of powered flight. We took Air Vice Marshal Edward Huddleston, who was representing the R.A.A.F. Chief of Air Staff. He was, at that time, Air Officer commanding No. 3 Group, Bomber Command. We were to spend 4 days there and were included in the various social functions. We had a perfect flight across France and over the Alps. The letdown and approach to Geneva Airport was a memorable scenic sight as we passed the Alps on each side and along Lake Geneva. The R.A.F. Association branch in Geneva looked after Mac and I, and we were accommodated in the best first-class hotel by Lake Geneva in the center of this beautiful city. Part of our program was a tour of the old League of Nations building and also a visit across the border to a French lakeside resort. We also attended several receptions laid on for all visitors. The main event was a large air display involving aircraft, both service and civilian, from all over the world, with 7 various Air Force jet formations participating. The main social function was a formal dinner, where I had the honor to meet Madame Jacqueline Auriol, the daughter of the President of France, a very distinguished lady aviatrix, and the first lady to fly a jet through the sound barrier. She did, however, still show terrible facial scars from burns received in a previous air crash when she nearly died. Also present were many world figures in aviation and crews from a large number of nations. It was an unforgettable weekend, helped by the weather which remained perfect throughout. We enjoyed an equally lovely return flight over the Alps as we had experienced on the inward flight to Geneva. Many of our trips with the Commander-in-Chief were to major events at various bases, one of which was a visit by the Duke of Edinburgh to R.A.F. Wittering. Another was a visit by the Chief of the Iraqi Air Force when we flew him into Bassingbourn. Further visits were to experimental units and aircraft factories where there was always so much to see. On one such visit we met the famous test pilot Roly Beaumont, and on that same occasion we had lunch with the equally famous Battle of Britain ace, Wing Commander Stanford Tuck. There were of course the regular visitors to Paris as mentioned before. These were great fun. For once we had flown into the airfield at Melonville and dropped the Commander-in-Chief off, we were free for a couple of days. We enjoyed an excellent arrangement in that we were able to stay at an American Services hotel in the center of Paris. This was the Hotel de l'État, just one block off the Champs-Élysées, where one night's accommodation cost only $1, with meals also cheap. Mac and I would cover every area of Paris we could, mostly on bus, metro or on foot, visiting all the famous sites. For lunch we would stop at a street-side cafe and have a French Roland ham, washed down with beer, whilst just watching the life of Paris pass by. Due to the low cost of our accommodation, our daily allowance would enable us to eat at a first-class restaurant at night and then visit one of the famous nightclubs. We really looked forward to those trips. Every so often we were able to carry out an Airways training flight, and for those trips we chose Jersey, in the Channel Islands. We would fly down in the morning and after having lunch, fly back in the afternoon. There was also the advantage on those trips of buying some duty-free grog and cigarettes which were always welcome. Amongst our overseas trips were several to R.A.F bases in Germany, and one year we took the Commander-in-Chief to the Paris Air Show at Le Bourget, and that was a great day out. At the close of the show there was a mad rush for all the VIP aircraft to get away, and this became too much for the French air traffic controllers to handle. In the end the duty controller gave up trying and gave out a block message to all the aircraft to taxi and take off at your own risk. From that point everything became more orderly and we all sorted ourselves out. I have never known such a flap by ATC before, or since. If there had been an accident involving a VIP aircraft the inquiry would have been interesting. On one VIP flight we picked up the air member for personnel, Air Chief Marshal Sir Francis Fogarty, to fly him to Edzell in Scotland. He told us he had just come from a meeting with the government at which a substantial services pay rise had been approved. That's the sort of news we like to hear. After we dropped him off we went up and stayed the night at Kinloss, where I renewed a few old friendships. All these VIP flights were in the Devon, a most pleasing aircraft to fly, especially equipped in the VIP role. In addition, I was the only person who flew it, so it felt like a personal aircraft. We had a corporal fitter engineer whose job was to just look after the Devon. He cared for it like it was his own. Corporal Ray was his name, and he was a first-class tradesman who understandably took a great pride in his work. One of the later flights I did was to carry Air Marshal Sir Thomas Pike, then Vice Chief of Air Staff, to visit the Vickers Aircraft Factory at Wisley to view the new Valiant bomber. This was memorable in that we had to depart early when news came through that the first R.A.F. bomber had crashed at Wittering, whilst on experimental duties out of Boscombe Down. The aircraft was flown by my old friend from 218 Squadron days, Flight Lieutenant Taffy Eccleston. They had been on a fast low run when the tail section came off and it crashed and exploded, causing a huge crater. The crew were all, as expected, killed. I flew up to look at the scene of the crash from the air and it was a very grim sight. It was made worse for me as it was piloted by such a very old friend. Sad news indeed. Our 2-year stint at High Wycombe was a very enjoyable part of our service life, both work-wise and socially. It was a lovely area to live in, with lots of good country pubs to visit, especially those along the River Thames on summer days. The officers' mess at HQBC was a fine mess and we enjoyed the company of our many good friends there. We played tennis quite often and took car outings around the Chiltern Hills and the towns and villages in the Thames Valley. London was only 30 miles away and we would frequently make visits there as well. Valerie had initially gone to a private school in High Wycombe, but she was desperately unhappy there, so we took her away and she went to a nearby village school at Lacey Green, where she was very happy. Usually, on our holidays we went up to Carnarvon, which was always enjoyable. Although not a keen golfer then, I played quite often at Aylesborough Golf Course, which was a nice course with fine views of the Vale of Aylesbury. It was just a few miles from the British Prime Minister's country residence at Chequers and we would drive past this famous historic home en route to the golf club. My time at BBCCF was drawing to a close and my thoughts turned to my future. The V-Bomber Force was developing fast, with the first Valiant Squadron formed at R.A.F. Gayton. Other V-Bombers, Victors and Vulcans were also on the way into service, with the most sought after being the Avro Vulcan, and that is the one I had set my sights on. The Commander-in-Chief discussed my future with me during one flight and he agreed to nominate me for a posting on Vulcans. He too was about to depart and was to be promoted to Air Chief Marshal and become the senior R.A.F. officer in NATO at Fontainebleau. The new Commander-in-Chief was to be my old boss Air Marshal Sir Harry Broadhurst, and my tour was to continue until his own personal pilot arrived from Germany. For the second time during my tour as his personal pilot, Sir George Mills gave me an annual assessment of exceptional as a pilot. This was a landmark in my flying career, and I was very proud to be classed in this highest possible category by the Commander-in-Chief personally. It was during this period that my posting to the V-Force on Vulcans was confirmed. Firstly, I would be doing a Canberra bomber conversion course at R.A.F. Bassingbourn which would commence in March. There were, however, to be some dramatic developments before I left the HQ Bomber Command, and they had been building up over a long period. The Canberra was a superb aircraft in general, but a disastrous defect had developed in the electrical system operating the flying controls. The elevator trim was operated by an actuator, and this had developed a serious electrical fault which could cause the actuator to run away and make a large movement on the elevator. If it ran away, the pilot lost control, and if it was in the down position, the aircraft dived out of control. The resultant crash killing the crew, especially if the aircraft was low down, with insufficient height to use the ejector seat and parachute to safety. I remember Sir Harry saying to me that if there was one more crash he would ground the whole Canberra force. Frantic efforts were being made by the aircraft manufacturers and R.A.F technical staff to correct the fault. On one flight, Sir Harry told me there had been a further fatal crash and he was going to ground the force on his return to HQ. It was a courageous decision. Once it was made, it could not be changed until the fault on the aircraft was rectified. I have always admired him for the strength of character in this momentous decision. I flew Sir Harry a few times before I left for my Canberra course, and that was fun. He liked to fly the aircraft, and when he arrived he liked to jump in the left-hand seat and get away. I would start up the starboard engine from the right-hand seat. As he got in, the door would be closed and I would start the port engine. By the time he got in the seat we were all set to move. He enjoyed his flying and had, of course, been a Battle of Britain station commander. It was a total difference to Sir Harry Mills, who preferred to interest himself with Mackenzie in the rear cabin, doing the radar navigation. My flying at Booker had, apart from the Devon Nottingham accident, been generally incident-free. There had, however, been one near miss when I was rehearsing aerobatics in a Chipmunk for a Battle of Britain display. I went into a dive and slow roll, and as I went inverted I pulled the elevator the wrong way. This caused me to hurtle towards the ground, and I only just managed to pull out of the subsequent dive and clear the ground. It was nearly a tragic mistake which could have cost me my life. All pilots make mistakes at times, but fortunately this time I got away with mine. My tour at Booker came to an end and I left for my Canberra course at Bassingbourn, near Cambridge. The course was only due to last 3 months, but because of the grounding of the Canberras it in fact lasted 6. There were 2 courses on Canberras, a short and a long course. We called ours the longest. Initially, we completed the ground's technical training on the aircraft, then came the interminable delay, as the aircraft were modified with a new and safe actuator system to prevent further disastrous crashes. As we were going to be stationed in Lincolnshire to fly V-bombers, my family were allocated a married quarter at R.A.F. Scampton, just 6 miles from Lincoln. Scampton was undergoing extensive reconstruction to its runways to take V-bombers. Meanwhile, families awaiting V-bomber training were allocated married quarters there. So we moved from Naphill to Scampton. I spent the weekend at Bassingbourn and travelled up to Scampton to be with Gladys and Valerie at weekends. Having completed the ground course on Canberras, we just hung around waiting for the aircraft to become cleared for us to start the flying phase. To keep busy we organised lots of sporting activities, playing cricket, tennis and golf. This was all very nice as it was summer, but very frustrating. Eventually, the modified Canberras became available and we started flying. I enjoyed flying this fine aircraft and teamed up with a very proficient navigator, Flight Lieutenant Jack Bell. He was also a very skilled motor mechanic working with one of the country's leading motor racing drivers. With so much waiting around at the start of the course we were able to spend a lot of spare time enjoying the fine local Cambridgeshire pubs. The course proceeded for the next few months and I successfully completed the necessary training. I was then posted as supernumerary to number 27 Squadron at Waddington near Lincoln to fly Canberras until I began Vulcan training. 2 momentous events occurred whilst I was at Waddington. The first was the Suez Crisis, which ended in debacle. After months of trouble with the Egyptian leader Abdel Nasser, during which time he closed the Suez Canal, Britain and France attacked Egypt by landing a large force at Port Said. Canberra squadrons in UK were sent to Cyprus to launch bombing attacks in support of the operation. Number 27 Squadron was ordered to Cyprus from Waddington. As only supernumerary to the squadron I did not go, but waited behind as a reserve in case further backup was needed. Before the squadron went, there was an agonizing wait as the British Prime Minister vacillated as to whether to attack Egypt or not. We coined the phrase to suit forward men it's on, it's off. Following the withdrawal, the Canberras came home, after they had successfully attacked the military targets in the battle area and various airfields including Cairo Airport. A second incident was the tragic crash of the Vulcan at London Airport. The pilot, squadron leader Podge Howard, and his wife were living near us at Scampton. On return from a 6-week tour, showing off the Vulcan right through to Australia and New Zealand, with Air Marshal Sir Harry Broadhurst on board. The aircraft crashed in poor weather on a radar approach into London Airport. Sir Harry and Howard were able to eject, but, with the undercarriage down, the crew members in the back could not. They died in the crash and their funeral was held at Waddington. The arguments as to who was responsible for the crash have never been satisfactorily answered, being lost in ministerial wrangles. I have my own knowledge of the event which I shall keep to myself. This event cast a widespread gloom in Bomber Command which took a long time to subside. Life went on and was all very leisurely as I had no other duties at Waddington, other than to do as much Canberra flying as possible. In addition to number 27 Squadron, I also flew with number 21 Squadron at times. Waddington was only a few miles south of Lincoln and I travelled daily from Scampton to Waddington. Eventually the first Vulcans arrived, but there was a huge backlog of crews waiting to be trained to fly them. Social life was quite good at Scampton and we made frequent trips into Lincoln to the famous Saracen's Head pub, better known to aircrew as the Wings Knob. One night in there we spent long time with the famous comedians Morecambe and Wise. They were doing their act at a local theatre, but before they became world famous. On one of my shopping trips into Lincoln I went to buy new potatoes, but came home with a new car, much to the amazement of Gladys and Valerie. I forgot to buy the spuds. The difference was about £400 for the new Ford Zephyr. Although I felt that the period of delay had been rather a bore, it had given us, as a family, a pleasant spell together with my not having much responsibilities at work. Fate was to take a hand and, unknowingly, I was about to receive a phone call that was to lead me to one of the most exciting adventures in my flying career, and my whole life.